It started as a rumor, the kind of thing students whisper to one another between classes. At Greystone High, an old brick building that had been standing for over a century, tales of haunted corridors and eerie apparitions were as much a part of the school culture as pep rallies and midterms. But the whispering hallway was different. Its story wasn't just an urban legend. It was real. The hallway was tucked away in the oldest wing of the school, a part that had been closed off for years. The doors leading to it were locked, chained, and plastered with faded "Do Not Enter" signs. No one seemed to know exactly why the wing was abandoned, only that it had been that way since the early 1980s. Some teachers muttered something about structural issues, but students had other theories. "It's because of the janitor," said Emma, a senior with a penchant for ghost stories. Mr. Hargrove was his name. He disappeared one night while cleaning that hallway. The only thing they found was his mop bucket, tipped over in a puddle of water. "Bull," scoffed Marcus, her skeptical friend. "If he vanished, wouldn't there have been like a police investigation?" "There was," Emma shot back. "My mom was a freshman here when it happened. She said the cops searched the entire school, but they never found him. People said you could hear his keys jingling in that hallway at night. That's why they closed it off." The conversation stuck with Julia, a quiet junior who had transferred to Greystone just a month ago. She didn't believe in ghosts, or so she told herself, but something about the story gnawed at her curiosity. That weekend, when most of her classmates were at a football game, she decided to see for herself. She slipped into the school through an unlocked side door, her phone flashlight cutting through the darkened halls. The building was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. She made her way toward the old wing, her footsteps echoing faintly. When she reached the chained double doors, she hesitated. For a moment, she considered turning back, but then she noticed something strange. The chain wasn't locked. It was looped loosely, as if someone had been there recently. Her heart pounding, Julia slid the chain off and pushed the doors open. The air on the other side was cold and carried the faint scent of mildew. The hallway stretched ahead, its tiled floor cracked and its walls streaked with grime. Her flashlight beam wavered as she stepped inside. At first, there was nothing unusual, just an old, forgotten corridor. But as she ventured further, she noticed the sound. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves. She froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, resolving into distinct voices, whispering, overlapping, unintelligible. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Hello?" Julia called out, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, oppressive and unnatural. She took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to leave. That's when she heard it, a metallic jingle, faint but unmistakable. Keys. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the sound. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood, silhouetted by her flashlight. It was a man, hunched slightly, with a mop in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. His face was obscured by shadows, but there was something wrong about the way he moved, jerky, like a puppet on strings. Julia stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. In the sudden darkness, the whispers surged again, louder and more urgent. She groped for her phone, her fingers brushing against cold, wet tiles instead. The puddle was spreading beneath her, soaking into her shoes. The scent of bleach stung her nose. A low, guttural growl came from the figure. The jingling keys grew louder, and the sound of wet footsteps approached. Panicking, Julia scrambled to her feet and bolted, her shoes squeaking against the slick floor. The whispers followed her, rising to a deafening crescendo as she burst through the double doors and slammed them shut behind her. She didn't stop running until she was outside, gasping for breath. When she finally looked back, the school was dark and still. The doors to the old wing were chained again, the padlock glinting in the moonlight. On Monday, Julia tried to tell her friends what had happened, but they brushed it off as a prank or a bad dream. Only Emma seemed to believe her. "You're not the first," Emma said grimly. "My mom told me that's how it always starts. You see him once, and then..." "Then what?" Julia pressed. Emma hesitated, lowering her voice. "Then you hear the keys, at home, at night, and he doesn't stop until he finds you." That night, as Julia lay in bed, she thought she heard a faint jingling outside her window.
Story number 2.
The Red Pen Curse. Harper Middle School had a strict rule: never leave red pens unattended in the teacher's lounge. It sounded ridiculous, even superstitious, but every teacher knew the rule wasn't up for debate. No one would say why, though whispers among students claimed it had to do with a tragedy no one dared to talk about. Ellie, a curious 8th grader, first heard about the red pen rule during lunch. Her science teacher, Mr. Bradshaw, had left one on his desk while lecturing. When the class ended, Ellie saw him nearly trip over himself to grab the pen, shoving it into his pocket like it might combust. "What's the big deal with red pens?" Ellie asked her best friend, Mia. Mia shrugged. "My sister told me a teacher died, and they found her with a red pen stuck in her hand. They said she was grading papers in the lounge." "Seriously?" Ellie laughed. "That's stupid. Maybe she just hated her job." Mia frowned. "It's not funny. My sister said after it happened the school banned them for a year. But every time someone brought one back, weird stuff started happening." "What kind of weird stuff?" "Like pens writing on their own, voices whispering in empty classrooms, and papers appearing graded with words no one wrote." Ellie rolled her eyes. "Sounds like a bad campfire story." Still, Ellie's curiosity was piqued. The next day, she snuck into the teacher's lounge during lunch break, making sure no one saw her. The room was ordinary, just a round table, a fridge humming in the corner, and a cabinet stuffed with office supplies. But on the table, a red pen sat alone, its shiny plastic casing practically daring her to pick it up. Ellie couldn't resist. She grabbed the pen and stuffed it into her backpack before sneaking back to class. That night, Ellie decided to test the pen while doing her homework. She clicked it open and began writing her name on a blank sheet of paper. The ink flowed smoothly, unnervingly bright against the page. "Cool," she muttered. Then she noticed something strange. The ink wasn't drying. It glistened like fresh blood. A chill crept up her spine, but she shrugged it off and set the paper aside. Hours later, when she reached for her homework again, the sheet she'd written on was blank. Her name had vanished, leaving only faint red smudges. Ellie frowned and clicked the pen again. She started writing random words. Her name, her school, the date. This time, the ink spread across the page like it was alive, tendrils branching out and forming letters on their own. "You took it!" Ellie's hand froze. The words weren't hers. She threw the pen across the room, her heart pounding. The pen hit the wall and rolled to a stop, its cap clicking back into place as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Ellie tried to return the pen to the teacher's lounge, but when she opened her backpack, it wasn't there. Instead, she found it on her desk at school, resting on top of a graded worksheet she hadn't finished. At the bottom, in bright red ink, were the words, "Wrong answer." Ellie's stomach churned. She asked Mia for advice, carefully leaving out details about the pen. "What happens if someone breaks the rule about red pens?" she whispered during class. Mia's face paled. "My sister said the pen gets attached to you. It starts small, messages, little pranks, but if you don't get rid of it fast, it'll start writing on you." "Writing on you?" Ellie repeated, her voice shaking. Mia nodded. "People said that's what happened to Mrs. Green, the teacher who died. Her arms were covered in red ink, but it wasn't ink. It was carved into her skin." That night, Ellie tried everything to destroy the pen. She snapped it in half, burned it in the sink, even buried it in her backyard. Each time she'd wake up to find it on her pillow, pristine and whole. The writing began soon after. First, it was faint, like scratches, small words scrawled across her arms and legs while she slept. "Mine. Stay. Forever." Then the pain started. Deep, searing cuts that felt like they were being carved by invisible hands. Desperate, Ellie returned to the teacher's lounge. She placed the pen on the table where she'd found it and whispered, "I'm sorry." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door slammed shut and the air grew icy. She turned to see words forming on the walls in thick, dripping ink. Too late. Ellie wasn't in school the next day, or the day after that. Her parents filed a missing person report, but the teachers avoided the subject, their faces tight with unease. In the lounge, the red pen sat untouched on the table, waiting for its next victim.
Story number 3.
Pinecrest High had one of those janitor closets no one ever went near. Not even the janitors. It was wedged at the end of a hallway in the basement, a forgotten windowless area used for storage and old furniture. No one cleaned it out, no one opened it, and when students walked by, they always swore they felt something watching them through the slats of the wooden door. The story went that 30 years ago, a janitor named Mr. Grady worked there. He was strange, to say the least. He'd mutter to himself, glaring at students as if he could see straight through them. People said he never left the school grounds, and late at night, you could hear him wheeling his mop bucket through the hallways. One day, Mr. Grady just stopped showing up. His absence wasn't noticed until a teacher smelled something terrible coming from the basement. They found him in the closet, dead. The official story said it was a heart attack, but the students whispered that it was something much worse. When they found his body, his fingers were worn down to the bone as if he'd clawed at the walls for days, and his eyes were wide open, staring into the void. They locked the closet after that, but the basement didn't stay quiet. Late at night, janitors would hear faint scratching sounds coming from inside. When someone was brave enough to investigate, the closet was always locked, but the sounds didn't stop. Fast forward to the present. Jenna, a junior with a knack for ignoring rules, was dared by her friends to spend 10 minutes in the janitor's closet. It was the night of the fall dance, and most of the school was upstairs in the gym. The basement was deserted, the only light coming from the flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead. Jenna wasn't scared, not at first. She hated ghost stories and thought the idea of Mr. Grady haunting a closet was laughable. "It's just a dumb old room," she said, snapping pictures with her phone as proof. "See? Nothing's here." Her friends laughed nervously but didn't follow her when she opened the closet door. The hinges groaned like something ancient and angry, and the smell hit her first, musty and metallic, like rusted iron and rotting wood. Inside, the closet was cramped and dark, with shelves of old cleaning supplies gathering dust. The floor was stained, and Jenna couldn't tell if it was from water damage or something else. She settled in, leaning against the back wall, her phone flashlight casting long, uneven shadows. At first, it was boring. Nothing but silence. She was about to call her friends and tell them to come back when she noticed something odd. The shadows weren't right. They weren't coming from her phone. Her breath hitched as one of the shadows moved. Slowly, deliberately. It stretched across the wall, long and thin like the outline of a person. Jenna spun around, but the closet was empty. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The shadow didn't respond. It just shifted, slinking toward the far corner of the room. Jenna aimed her flashlight, and for a split second she saw them. Two glowing eyes, wide and staring, buried in the darkness. She bolted for the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She screamed for her friends, pounding on the wood until her fists ached. The shadows twisted around her, wrapping the room in darkness. The scratching sound started then, soft at first, like nails on fabric. "Let me out," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, until it was all she could hear. Suddenly, everything stopped. The door swung open, and Jenna stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. Her friends were gone. The dance music was gone. The hallways were empty. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing. The lights flickered, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure standing at the far end of the hall, a hunched man with a mop in his hand. When the lights steadied, the figure was gone, but the smell of bleach lingered. Jenna ran upstairs, desperate to find someone, anyone. The gym was dark, the decorations half torn, and the tables overturned. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fumbled it out, only to find a message she hadn't sent. "Come to the closet. I'm waiting." The text was signed Grady. When the janitors opened the closet the next morning, they found Jenna's phone lying in the corner, its screen cracked and smeared with blood. The door had been locked the whole night. No one ever dared to open it again.
Story number 4.
Elmwood High had a peculiar tradition. Detention wasn't held in the library or a regular classroom. It was held in room B103, a space everyone called the quiet room. Teachers insisted it was the perfect place for troublemakers because the room was soundproofed years ago during renovations. But the students knew better. They said the room wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. The quiet room sat at the end of a dark corridor in the basement, far from the rest of the school. The air there was colder, and even the fluorescent lights seemed dimmer. A single dusty window high up on one wall let in a thin trickle of gray light, and no matter how many times the janitors cleaned it, the walls were stained with faint, shadowy marks, like handprints smudged into the paint. The legend went that 20 years ago, a student named Darren Wells got locked inside the room by accident. He had fallen asleep during detention, and the teacher left, forgetting Darren was still there. No one found him until the next morning, curled up in a corner, mumbling nonsense and clawing at his own arms. He didn't come back to school after that. Some said he'd gone mad. Others whispered that the quiet room had taken something from him: his voice, his sanity, his soul. Teachers dismissed the stories as ridiculous, but students swore the room was cursed. They said if you stayed in the quiet room too long, you'd start hearing things: scratching sounds, faint whispers, even your own name. And if you heard your name 3 times, something would come for you. One Friday, Logan, a cocky sophomore with a knack for causing trouble, was sent to detention in the quiet room after getting caught skipping class. He laughed off the warnings from his classmates, brushing aside their worried looks. "It's just a stupid old room," he said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "I'll survive." The teacher on duty, Mr. Collins, escorted Logan down to B103 and unlocked the door. "Sit here," Mr. Collins said, his voice clipped. "I'll be back in an hour. No phones, no talking, no nonsense." Logan rolled his eyes and slouched into a chair. The teacher left, locking the door behind him. The room was small and bare, with a single desk, a flickering fluorescent light, and that grimy window that barely let in any light. Logan pulled out a pencil and started doodling on the desk, the silence pressing against his ears. At first, it was fine. Boring, but fine. But after 20 minutes, Logan noticed something strange. The sound of the pencil scratching against the desk seemed too loud, almost echoing in the small space. He paused, holding his breath. That's when he heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere near the back of the room. "Hello?" he called out, half joking. No answer. The room was still. Logan shook his head and went back to doodling, but the tapping started again. It was louder this time, more insistent. It sounded like fingernails against the walls. "Cut it out," he said, turning around. "I know someone's messing with me." But the room was empty. The tapping stopped. Logan exhaled, laughing nervously at himself. "You're losing it, man," he muttered. Then he heard it. A voice. Faint and raspy, like someone whispering through clenched teeth. "Logan." He froze. The voice was so quiet he wasn't even sure he'd heard it. "Hello?" he said again, louder this time. Silence. Logan stood up, his pulse racing. He pressed his ear to the door, hoping to hear footsteps in the hallway, but it was dead quiet. That's when the voice came again, closer this time. "Logan." His name was drawn out, almost taunting. His stomach flipped as he spun around, his back pressed against the door. The light flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the walls. "Who's there?" he shouted. The whisper came one last time, louder and clearer. "Shh, Logan." The sound was right next to his ear. Panicked, Logan banged on the door, screaming for Mr. Collins. The shadows on the walls twisted, stretching into long, spindly shapes that reached toward him. The tapping turned into scraping, nails dragging against the walls. Finally, the door flew open, and Mr. Collins stood there, his face pale. "What the hell's going on?" Logan bolted past him without answering, tears streaming down his face. He never told anyone what happened, but he refused to go near the basement again. The next week, another student was sent to the quiet room. When they walked in, they found Logan's desk still there, his pencil snapped in half. And on the wall behind it, faint and jagged, were the words, "I'm still here."
Story number 5.
The Chalkboard Keeper. Every school has its quirks, but Meadowbrook High was infamous for its silent classroom. Room 202 in the East Wing had been unused for decades, its doors sealed shut with heavy chains. The official reason? A hazardous gas leak years ago had rendered the room unsafe. The students, of course, had their own version. They called it the Chalkboard Keeper. It all started back in the 1970s, when a young teacher named Miss Ellery was assigned to teach in room 202. She was strict, meticulous, and obsessed with one thing above all else: silence. She believed silence was the key to discipline, and any noise during her class was punished severely. Students whispered about how she had a special fondness for chalkboards, not just for teaching, but for discipline. If a student misbehaved, Miss Ellery would make them stand at the board and write out lines. "I will be silent," over and over, sometimes for hours. If they stopped, she'd tap the board with her long, bony finger and say, "Keep writing." One day, something snapped. A student named Jeremy defied her. He refused to stop talking, even as she loomed over him, her face pale with rage. Witnesses say she grabbed him by the arm, dragged him to the chalkboard, and forced the chalk into his hand. "You'll write until you learn," she hissed. Jeremy started writing, but he didn't stop. His classmates said his arm moved like it wasn't his own, his eyes wide with terror. The words on the chalkboard changed from "I will be silent" to something no one could understand. Twisting symbols, jagged lines, and words in a language that wasn't human. When Miss Ellery tried to take the chalk from him, the lights in the room flickered. The door slammed shut, and when they finally broke it open, Miss Ellery was gone. All that was left was the chalkboard, now covered with writing no one dared to erase. Since then, no one had taught in room 202. The school locked it up, but students claimed they could still hear the screech of chalk against the board at night. Fast forward to the present. A dare was all it took for Jordan, a sophomore with a reputation for trouble, to sneak into the silent classroom during lunch. His friends crowded around the chained door, urging him on. "You're scared," teased his friend Zach. "Yeah, right," Jordan scoffed. He'd stolen a set of bolt cutters from the shop class, and with a few determined snips, the chains fell away. The door creaked open, revealing a classroom frozen in time. Dust coated the desks, and the air was stale and suffocating. At the far end of the room stood the chalkboard, its surface black and smooth, but eerily spotless despite years of abandonment. "See," Jordan said, stepping inside. "Nothing to it." But as soon as he crossed the threshold, the air grew colder. His friends urged him to come back, but Jordan couldn't resist the pull of the chalkboard. A single piece of chalk lay on the tray, impossibly clean. "Go on! Write something!" Zach shouted from the hall, his voice shaky. Jordan grabbed the chalk and pressed it to the board. He meant to write something funny, but his hand moved on its own. The chalk screeched loudly, and the sound seemed to fill the entire room. "I am silent!" The words appeared before Jordan could stop himself. He tried to pull his hand away, but it wouldn't budge. His arm moved again, scrawling more words across the board. "Silence is mine!" "Guys, help me!" Jordan screamed, his voice cracking with panic. But his friends had fled, leaving him alone with the board. The chalk moved faster now, his fingers cramping as they gripped it tight. The lights in the room flickered violently, and the writing grew more chaotic. Symbols, spirals, and jagged slashes that seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. In the flickering light, Jordan saw her. Miss Ellery stood in the corner of the room, her face pale and her eyes sunk in hollows. Her lips didn't move, but her voice echoed in his mind. "Keep writing. Never stop." Jordan's screams were muffled as the air around him grew thick and oppressive. The room was silent once again. The next day, the chains on room 202 were back in place, as if they had never been removed. Jordan was reported missing, and his friends swore they hadn't seen him since lunch. The janitor who cleaned the east wing that night claimed he heard faint whispers coming from room 202, followed by the unmistakable screech of chalk against the board. And when he peeked through the keyhole, he swore he saw the chalk moving on its own, scrawling words over and over, "I will be silent."
Story number 6.
Hollow Creek High had always been an old creaky building, but the strangest thing about it was Locker 319. Tucked into a dim corner of the east wing, 319 had been sealed shut for as long as anyone could remember. Unlike the other lockers, its surface was covered in faint scratches, as if someone or something had clawed at it from the inside. No one knew why it was sealed, but the rumors were endless. Some students whispered that it belonged to a kid who disappeared decades ago. Others said a teacher found something horrific inside. A blood-stained notebook, a rotting hand, or worse. Whatever the truth, the school staff refused to answer questions about it. For years, Locker 3119 sat undisturbed, until Mia transferred to Hollow Creek. Mia wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. She'd rolled her eyes at the warnings her classmates gave her. "Don't go near 319, they said. "Weird stuff happens when you get too close." "Sure it does," Mia replied, brushing them off. One day, as she walked past the locker on her way to chemistry class, she felt a strange tug, like a magnetic pull, urging her to stop. Curious, she stepped closer. The air around the locker was colder, and she noticed something odd, a faint whisper, just below the edge of hearing. She leaned in, pressing her ear against the cool metal. The whisper grew louder, like a faint voice calling her name. "Mia." She jumped back, her heart pounding. Her classmates were right behind her, watching with wide eyes. "Told you," one of them said. "It's just an old locker," Mia snapped, brushing off the unease creeping up her spine. But that night she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, Mia found herself drawn to 319 again. This time, she wasn't alone. Liam, her lab partner, had dared her to see if she could open it. "It's locked," she said, trying the handle. "So break it," Liam replied with a mischievous grin. Rolling her eyes, Mia grabbed a paperclip from her bag and bent it into a crude lockpick. To her surprise, the lock clicked open almost immediately. "See? Nothing to it," she said. But as the door swung open, the air around them seemed to grow heavy, like the atmosphere just before a storm. Inside the locker was a single item, a small leather-bound journal. "Creepy," Liam muttered. Mia picked up the journal and flipped it open. The pages were covered in spidery handwriting, but the words didn't make sense. Random phrases, strange symbols, and what looked like names, crossed out one by one. Her blood ran cold when she saw her own name at the bottom of the last page, written in fresh ink. Mia Carter. "This is some kind of joke," she said, slamming the journal shut. But as she did, the locker door creaked, closing on its own. That night, Mia couldn't sleep. She kept hearing faint whispers, just like the ones near the locker. She checked her room multiple times, but nothing seemed out of place. Finally, she shoved the journal into her closet and tried to forget about it. But the next morning, the journal was back on her desk, open to a new page. Written in neat, crimson letters were the words, "Time's up." Panicked, Mia tried to return the journal to the locker, but when she got there, the locker wouldn't open. The whispers grew louder, and she felt the cold air pressing against her. That night, her classmates found her at her desk in homeroom, her face pale and her hands clutching the journal tightly. She was staring straight ahead, unblinking, her lips muttering something no one could understand. The school closed locker 319 again after that, sealing it with chains and a padlock. But sometimes, students swear they hear faint whispers when they pass by, and if they listen closely, they might hear their names being called, followed by the sound of a journal's pages turning.
Story number 7.
The old school building of Blackwood Academy had been abandoned for years, its corridors shrouded in dust and silence. The new school had been built across town, but the old structure still stood, a forgotten relic of the past. No one went near it except the school's night watchman, Mr. Harper. His job was simple: check the perimeter, make sure no trespassers got inside, and report any unusual activity. Most nights were quiet. The building was surrounded by rusting chain-link fences, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. But one night, as Harper was making his rounds, he noticed something strange. A light was flickering on the 3rd floor. At first, he thought it was just the reflection of a passing car, but the light didn't fade. It pulsed faintly, like the glow of an old fluorescent bulb. Harper sighed, grabbed his flashlight, and unlocked the gate. "Probably just some kids messing around," he muttered. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The smell of mildew and rot hit him like a wall, and his boots crunched on shattered glass and debris. He followed the faint glow, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The closer he got, the colder the air became, biting against his skin despite the summer night outside. When he reached the 3rd floor, he saw it. Room 306. The light was coming from inside, spilling out through the narrow crack beneath the door. "Anyone in there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. No response. Harper reached for the doorknob, but it was ice cold, stinging his skin. He turned it slowly and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Dust-covered desks sat in neat rows, and a long-forgotten chalkboard was covered in faint smudges. But the light was real, glowing faintly from a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. As he stepped inside, Harper noticed something odd. The desks weren't empty. Each one held a piece of paper, yellowed with age. He picked up the nearest one and squinted at the writing. The words were shaky, scrawled in dark pencil, "I didn't mean to." Frowning, he moved to the next desk. The paper there read, "It wasn't my fault," and the next, "I'm sorry." The words repeated on every sheet, each one written in a different hand. Harper's unease deepened, and he turned to leave, but stopped dead in his tracks. The door he'd entered through was gone. In its place was a solid wall, as if the doorway had never existed. "Hello?" he shouted, spinning around. The light flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness before buzzing back to life. And that's when he saw them. The desks weren't empty anymore. Figures sat in them, shadowy, indistinct shapes with hollow eyes that stared straight at him. Their faces were blurred, as if smeared like wet paint, and their hands rested motionless on the desks. "Who's there?" Harper demanded, his voice shaking. One of the figures stood slowly, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. It raised a hand, pointing at the chalkboard behind him. Harper turned, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The chalkboard was no longer blank. Written in jagged, uneven letters were the words, "Leave." Harper didn't need to be told twice. He turned back toward the wall where the door had been, clawing at the plaster in desperation. The light flickered again, and he felt the cold press of something against his back, like icy fingers brushing his spine. When the light steadied, he was outside. The door to the old building was shut tight behind him, and his keys were back in his hand. The next day, Harper quit his job. No one believed his story, of course, but he didn't care. He never set foot near Blackwood Academy again. And to this day, if you pass the old school at night, you might see a faint light flickering on the third floor. But no one dares to go inside.